Happy Halloween. And I think we are actually live here from Continual. And thanks for everybody for joining us this evening. So tonight it's movie night, and of course we're thinking everybody's about done wrapping up with the trick-or-treaters, at least if you're here on the East Coast. And if you're not, well, then you can come in and join us later. So as you come in tonight, we are for movie night. We are going to have one and only Monster House from 2006. So we'll be starting that up here just about 8 o'clock Eastern. We'll be posting the stream keys out there for that here shortly so that everybody can come in and join and hang out with us for a bit. But before we start that tonight, we did have a few friends that joined us for Halloween this year and did a couple of special things for us here at Continual, and we want to thank them for that. First of all, we want to thank Valentine Wolf. Of course, you can find them at valentinewolf.com for coming in and doing some original scores for us for a couple of our favorite authors who did some readings of some short stories for us for this this Halloween season. So up first is going to be a reading from Alidria Hurt, and you can find her at alidriahurt.com. And she is going to be reading her piece called Sour Ground, which is a nice creepy piece for this Halloween evening. Then up next, we're going to play Liana Renee Heber. And she has got a piece that is from a great anthology in a collection, and it is Not More Lovely. And so both of these are some great, nice, creepy readings for this evening for Halloween. And again, we'll be getting started here with the movie night starting just about 8 o'clock. But we thought we'd bring you a little bit of special something before we got started tonight. So first up, we're going to go with Allie Hurt and her reading of Sour Ground. And again, we want to thank Allie for doing her piece, and is also Valentine Wolf for giving us the original score and all of that sets a great tone. So we'll see you back on the other side. All right, we're going to try that one more time because it decided to rescale. So we're going to start that all over again.
Sour ground. I never expected the lottery would pick me, but then again, I never expected anything would come of my life except for one day I would be drowned as those before me were. Maybe this was just the way it was supposed to be. All the oracles can be wrong at some point, right? I didn't know how else to think about it. The ground is sour, broken and evil in places. There are few places where we can bury our dead, and even fewer many would consider consigning to that plot of land. A trek to reach, the burial ground had a feature few had seen in many years: a tree. We all knew what the tree looked like, because its depiction was on everything. We lived for the life of that tree, but it was definitely not something many of us expected to see in our lifetime. I would get to see the tree. That alone would make the trip worthwhile. But I would see the tree while carrying the remains of a beloved on the back of a misshapen pony. It was not exactly the way any of us wanted to see it. Elder Karras had been a town elder over Sweetwaters for many years, certainly longer than I had been alive, and yet he never seemed to carry the weight of his age with him when he moved. Therefore, when he died, it came as a surprise to many. There were those who knew how old he was, certainly. They were spread thin by their own age by then. His death shocked the community so much that the customary silence of mourning, 3 days' time, was only punctuated by the sobs of the grieving. Not even the children seemed capable of mustering their usual childish whispers during it. At the end of the 3 days, the town, myself along with it, gathered together on water and drew lots. Everyone of age was given a smooth stone with a symbol on it. The symbol was inked on your hand so that the remaining elders knew who had each stone. There were not many of us. My stone bore the likeness of the setting sun. It was inked onto the back of my hand. I sat in quiet anticipation of who would be drawn for the sacred duty of accompanying the remains to the burial place, taking them to the tree, and then returning to tell of the world beyond the lake where we made our home. I did not expect it to be me. I was young and small, and often the last picked at the children's games of who could hold their breath the longest. I simply wasn't strong. The setting sun stone was drawn. It was my time to see the tree. It was my time to take the remains of the beloved to the earth from which we had come. I could have broken for all that I understood what was going on. Elder Karras was carried to the edge of the lake by a procession of boats. There a small set of ponies were kept for this journey. Those who tended them were called twins, for they lived on the water and on the sour ground of the land. They were as misshapen as their ponies, but they greeted us with smiles. One of them even spoke to me. I didn't understand the words, but the smile said things were well between us. I had my supplies for the journey: salted fish and water from the lake, algae cakes and watercress which I could keep for a time, but would need to eat early in my journey. The wrapped remains were placed on the back of the pony, and I mounted. It was like being in a boat during a storm, the way the creature moved. It took me several moments before I could truly be said to be riding instead of being allowed to sit atop. I set out from there the next morning, observing the sun rising over the land for the first time in my adult life. The next day, I had traveled as far as I could in the sweltering heat of the day. I would have to travel at night for the rest of the journey. Funny how different things felt off the water. It was as if the sun, already heavy, beat down on me like a constant crest of waves. I couldn't think of anything except keeping my head as cool as possible and allowing my mount to go in the direction which had been indicated by our elders who saw us off. I didn't know where I was going, only that I would know it when I reached the tree. The first night was not terrible. I could still feel the breeze coming from the lake. The second day, though, we traveled beyond the gentle kiss of the wind off the water and into the land where even the air seemed sick with poison. I didn't know what to think except to focus on the tree. By the third day, I wondered if it was indeed real. I could have been following an illusion. I could have been a funerary procession of one meant to follow the elder into the afterlife by carrying their body as far from our village as possible. Hope dried up like an unintended puddle in my heart. I didn't think anywhere could be so far away from where we began. Yet as I continued to travel, No blessed tree came into sight. I passed stone monoliths. I passed what looked like a face half buried in sand. I passed bones I shuddered to think of as mortal as me. Still no tree. Night fell without any attempt at subtlety. At one moment sun, then seemingly and suddenly the blackness of a star-struck sky. Or perhaps I dozed. The animal beneath me stumbled and startled me awake. When it crashed forward, headlong into the rotten dirt, I, for all my ungainliness, leapt clear. The corpse near forgotten, I considered turning back. My elder would not care to see me die in this place, so far from home, where my body would feed what? I had seen no animals since leaving the lake. Not one bird's cry to another, or anything that might even consider the corpse of my pony its dinner. 3 days from civilization, 3 days into the wilderness, 3 days from the familiar, and 3 days into the lost. I considered turning back. And then I began to drag the corpse in the direction of the unseen tree. It had to be there. It had to be. Otherwise, there would be nothing for me to die out there for. Still no tree. The sour ground invaded my lungs with dust until I coughed at every breath. I understood why now we humans had fled to the water. The water could only drown you. The ground? Oh, the ground changed you. No one would eat of the rotten ground. No one, and I was far from being no one. Then it was there, rising from the ground, with its brown and gold leaves splayed above to make a canopy which rivaled the sky. I reached it. I rested in its shade. I saw where those who had come before. The tree had carried up into its trunk some of our dead as it grew. Their faces stared out at me from the wood. I did the best I could to breathe as little of the toxins I had brought with me out in its presence. How had it come to be here, in the middle of the land, untouched by the grossness of the ground around it? It did not matter. The elder Karis would be buried in its shade. I had no tools, or even implements, only my hands, so I began to dig. The ground slowly began to change me as I dug. My arms, seemingly tireless, grew heavier and heavier, yet I could still dig, so dig I did. I dug until my eyes saw nothing but a film of the reddish-brown clay-like substance the ground had become. Then I brought the body into the grave. I laid down beside it to enjoy the shade after such labor. Crawling out again, I was not myself. I howled at the moon hanging above with no contingent of stars. I felt the fur sticking to my back, slick with clay. My eyes saw further than they once had. The ground had changed me. The journey had brought me home. And there I stayed, a creature of the sour ground, watcher over the tree and those who had come and gone before.
So, and I hope you enjoyed that one. from Alidria Hurt, and of course, the original score by our friends at Valentine Wolf. And so, for those of you that want to join us for movie night, the links are now posted up in the group and the invite, and I'll be posting them a couple of more places as well if you would like to join us for the Netflix watch party of Monster House. But up next is going to be the second show of the evening, which is from Leanna Renee Heber. And again, our friends at Valentine Wolf were nice enough to score this for us with another original score. So I'm probably going to have to line this one up again since it decided to realign everybody this evening. But hang on just a minute and we'll have our second reading.
Hello, I'm Leanna Renee Heber. I'm going to be reading one of my short stories entitled Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee, which is featured in A Winter's Tale, Horror Stories for the Yuletide, and in Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee. It is a sequel to Edgar Allan Poe's The Oval Portrait. In The Oval Portrait, an artist quite literally paints his young bride to death. This is my sequel. Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee. It was said that the artist had abandoned the fine house in the mountains, that richly appointed chateau with a turret where countless rooms stood silent, adorned with art and colored glass. Rumor had it that the cellar was an open pit, and the upstairs floorboards creaked and thumped. It was said that he'd left the village haunted after the untimely death of his young bride, but then again, the peasants below were full of superstition. It wasn't that anyone had seen her, but the disappearance of her lovely Glee was a haunt in reverse. The absence of a once beautiful treasure was the living's own ghost to bear. She was talked about. Her memory had life, and in it, she was again not more lovely than full of glee, as the very mention of her made the elders smile. Then they'd cluck their tongues and ask the rhetorical question of what happened to her. They knew in their hearts. Out, out, brief candle. She'd been snuffed. It was Christmas time, Christmas Eve to be specific, when the artist made his way back to the sorrowful site, in hopes that the season of peace and forgiveness could create an alchemical change in his heart and his fortunes. What better time to reckon with the past and turn a new page, a heart made pure as the mountainside under a fresh blanket of undriven snow. When the artist's driver reached the end of the lane, the old man hesitated. "Go on, sir," the artist assured. "I'll walk from here. Turn around, get that shivering mare into a warm stable. I'll be all right." He unleashed his leather case from the back of the carriage. "I'm home again, and I have to make my peace with that." The hunched driver crossed himself and turned his hack sharply, murmuring a benediction for the artist's soul and something about her that became lost in a gust of wind. The chateau loomed ahead at the end of the tree-lined lane, its form like a skull on the edge of a cliff. The last of the day's light glinted off eye-like windows, and the land below was ushered swiftly away in a sheer drop. With a crunching tread through deepening drifts, the artist made his way forward. He glanced up at a noisy blackbird grumbling at a treetop, noting that the branches arching above him had begun to gnarl and knot, claws in a tangle. A warning from the morning halted him at the property's wrought iron gate, which yawned open at the latch. He recalled the woman in the train bench in front of him when he handed his ticket over to the conductor and said what town he'd be stopping in. She turned around, mourning veil nearly obscuring her wrinkled face. "Take care there, my son. Yuletide or no, It is a place of curious endings. These words had chilled him enough to make him reconsider his return. He had opted not to go through the town and up the rugged pass, but instead continue on the rail north and take the higher road privately back. He was sure if he'd paraded through the central pass, there would be whispers and cruelties spoken not enough out of earshot. His sorrow was heavy enough without gossip weighing it further. Stepping up the overgrown flagstones to the hefty carved oak front door, the artist noted the glass on either side was broken, the lock forced. He shouldn't have been surprised that brigands took evident shelter here, assuming the place was abandoned. They hadn't been wrong. After the funeral, the once romantic nest had become as silent as the lily-marked grave down below. The artist didn't dare look down the side of the mountain at that valley churchyard. The only comfort he could muster was what he hoped still lay ahead, hung on the walls inside: his art. Once inside the foyer, he struck a match to light the front braziers, and then struggled with the resistant wick of an oil lantern. Lamp finally lit, by jaundiced light, he began his tour of plaster walls lined with paintings and dark wooden roof beams decked with spiderwebs. The colored glass lining the windows was as dark as the night sky, but his art remained safe within. He sighed in relief. In the main hall were his vast landscapes, ruins, abbeys, castles. Up the curving stairs were the faces, patrons, scholars, nobles. They were works of great renown, each a captured flash of fervor and obsession. Now, here, they were his witnesses. He hadn't stopped painting during his time away. He did have to eat to survive, and there were no other skills to which he was suited. But looking at these pictures here, remembering them again, feeling them in his fingers as if he were still sculpting the paint onto just the right texture, nothing he'd painted of late had the life of these earlier works. And nothing, of course, had the life of her. Perhaps that's why all the art had been left alone, deemed haunted. There were footprints tracked in the dust ahead of him as he climbed the curving stone stair, the lamplight illuminating a limited arc ahead of him. 2 pairs of feet, then just one as the furthest chamber was reached. He paused at the open door. The prints of the boots were hardly fresh, so it had been some time since the trespass. And as the steps were few, the place must have been denounced as eerie enough to ward off subsequent intruders. At the end of the hallway stood the turret room that had held his most precious treasures, his best work. The place where he captured her adoring look, forever, to the last. The night was a dark one, and very little light came through the lancet windows ahead. If the artist wasn't mistaken, even the lamplight hesitated at the threshold, as if it didn't dare disrupt the deep shadows within. Trembling, he took a deep breath and stepped into the chamber. The bed curtains across the room were open, and the bound book that had chronicled all the artistic works within the house lay open to a final page, atop the rumpled bedclothes. His mind swam. Had a friend, the week she died, offered to add in one final entry? The artist didn't remember and was too unnerved to look. Instead, he bent to set the lantern upon the floor, cast the book aside, and lay down upon the dusty bed, folding in upon himself to weep. It wasn't that he hadn't mourned then. It was that he'd gone into a detached state and felt like he was only now waking up, jarred to the truth of the empty place, her vacancy. He had been so obsessed with the look of her and how to translate it, he hadn't considered the reality of her. It is a place of curious endings. She had ended here. And yet, what was art but a chance at eternal life? He tried to bring the image of her to mind, of her beautiful face, even as she was laid out in her winding sheets. But all he could see was the flurry of brush strokes in his mind's eye. All he could seem to recall was the drag of horsehair on the palette and the angle of the dim light. He had tried so desperately to capture what was always said of her, glee above loveliness. The final result was, of course, stunning, unearthly, but it had been cast aside when the health of his model, his wife, vanished. "Forgive me," he whispered to the empty room. Bare trees scraped against the narrow windows like the scratch of fingernails. The portrait was there on the wall behind a curtain. After the funeral, the artist had placed it in the deepest of shadows. All he had to do was lift the lamp, draw the shade, and confront his fated masterpiece. Face down on his coat sleeve, he steeled himself and wiped his streaming eyes on his cuff. That's when he heard a footstep. A light footstep. From the corner of the room, a slow, pervasive paralysis crept over him. Another step. The creak of a floorboard. He did not dare lift his head now. Another step at the head of the bed. Shifting his face, unable to help himself, he peered between his fingers. The curtain over his wife's oval portrait was drawn aside. The frame was empty. A sound left his throat, something strangled and shocked. The shadows to the side of him, mere feet from him, moved. In a scramble, he reached for his lantern, lifting it up with a choking, "Who's there?" There she stood. Shaking, the artist lowered the lantern, but its arc was wide enough to capture her whole form at the head of the bed, dressed in the dark gown she'd been painted in. My God. There was a glow about her like a phantom, and yet her small, slippered feet were planted upon the ground, as much solid as shade. Her face looked just as he painted her, but the curve of her smile was terrifying. Then the figure spoke. Her voice was soft, musical, glancing off the artist's ear as if from across the hall, not right before him. "Hello, husband." She smiled an obedient, sharp-toothed smile. "How do I look?" He gaped at her. She took another light step forward, coming around the bed towards his cowering form. Her feet sounded on the boards, and yet no dust was disturbed in her wake. "Am I not more lovely than full of glee?" she asked. "Is that not what always was said? It is important to remember what has been said." He fell to his knees, crossing himself. A miracle, though how can it be that you are here now? I buried you, my sweetheart." She drew close. Cold hands that abrased like dry canvas shot out to cup his cheeks. "You did, my husband," she murmured hungrily. Her dark eyes flickered to the wall. "But my life was here all along. You saw to that. Down to the last spark of my body's vitality that you gave to the glint in my painted eye. Did you not think there may be more than one way to take and give a life?" Still in her unsettling hold, he tilted his head to the side, not understanding her question. She did the same in an eerie mirror. "The storytelling," she explained, "the tales told of me. I suppose you wouldn't have thought of it. Your art was in paint. Your mind in lines and strokes, I understand, but you're here now to see the power of the word. It giveth and taketh away." His wild fervor was held by her sharp fingernails. Her smile broadened, gleeful indeed, as she bent to kiss him. He shuddered in her grasp. His color leapt from his cheek to hers. A spark leapt up. That ineffable, glittering light, that unfathomable mystery. She caught the luminous wisp in a deep breath, rolled it on her parched tongue, and swallowed it whole. The artist slid to the floor, motionless. The book that chronicled the entire gallery of the chateau, indeed, works of great renown, stood open to the very page that told of her demise, her sacrifice. That the book was open proved it had been read. Someone had come to bear witness to her tale, but it was as yet unfinished. She plucked a pen from the prone artist's pocket and added to the narrative which had ended abruptly with her death. She continued the tale. Yes, dead she may have been, but what has the finest wit of our age said? Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Perhaps, but it must also then be said, death imitates art far more than art imitates death. If art captures life, then I was never wholly dead, and words have resurrected me. I have stepped out of the frame, to begin anew. Church bells tolled the midnight mass to proclaim a special child was born to a peasant, urging the world to tell tales of sacrifice and eternal life. She stepped out of the turret, strong footfalls treading the sonorous floorboards. She kept walking until she reached the town below, where tales of her reached further still, not more cautionary than full of fear. Thank you. That was Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee, as appearing in A Winter's Tale, Horror Stories of the Yuletide. My name is Liana Renee Heber, and happy Halloween.
And that was Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee by Liana Renee Heber, and of course, originally scored by our friends at Valentine Wolf. And so if you do like any of those, please do feel free to check out their websites, Amazon, all that kind of good stuff, and do support them as well as our folks here at Continual. And so I want to thank everybody for coming in and hanging out with me for a bit this evening. And so now, just a couple of minutes, we'll be starting up Monster House as a Netflix watch party. If you want to get the link, please jump into the Continual group or on the Continual page, and it's out there for you. We'll be starting it up in just a few minutes. Thanks, everybody.